Hey guys, happy Friday. You ready to get some reading done this weekend? So, have another book for you for First Chapter Friday. This is another collection from my book of the month, and it's another one that I haven't yet read, but oh my gosh, it sounds so good. So, this one is called The Holdout, a novel by Graham Moore. And on the cover, it says, "One juror changed the verdict. What if she was wrong?" Ooh. So I will, just like, and let me scoot up a little bit. Just like in previous weeks, I'm going to read, there's nothing on the back, so I'm going to read the inside flap, and then I'll read the first chapter. All right. From the Academy Award-winning screenwriter of The Imitation Game and best-selling author of The Last Days of Night, a jury on a murder trial is deadlocked when a young woman manages to turn the tide to acquit. A decade later, she must face the consequences when a fellow juror is killed, and she is the prime suspect. Doesn't that sound good? Oh my gosh. It's the most sensational case of the decade. 15-year-old Jessica Silver, heiress to $1 billion real estate fortune, vanishes on her way home from school, and her teacher, Bobby Knock, is the prime suspect. The subsequent trial taps straight into America's most pressing preoccupations: race, class, sex, law enforcement, and the lurid sins of the rich and famous. It's an open and shut case for the prosecution, and a quick conviction seems all but guaranteed until Maya Seal, a young woman on the jury, convinced of Knock's innocence, persuades the rest of the jurors to return the verdict of not guilty, a controversial decision that will change all of their lives forever. Flash forward 10 years. A true crime docuseries reassembles the jury, excuse me, with particular focus on Maya, now a defense attorney herself. When one of the jurors is found dead in Maya's hotel room, all evidence points to her as the killer. Now she must prove her own innocence by getting to the bottom of a case that is far from closed. As the present-day murder investigation weaves together with the story of what really happened during their deliberation, told by each of the jurors in turn, the secrets they have all been keeping threaten to come out, with drastic consequences for all involved. Doesn't that sound good? Oh my gosh. I'm just about to finish The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo. I think I'm going to read this one next. All right, so let me read the first chapter. Plus, the cool thing is when I do these for First Chapter Friday, when I start reading, I can start on Chapter 2. The Holdout. Chapter 1. Oh, and it goes back and forth. It's one of those that's told from different perspectives. It goes from present day, and this is kind of how the Sundown Motel does the same thing, but you'll have like a chapter or two present day, kind of what's going on when they reassemble, in this case, when they reassemble the jury, and then kind of a flashback. And so it's like they kind of come together. Okay, there have been several books that I've read that have been like that. So you have not only kind of this docu-series that's being put together, but then you also have, I don't know exactly where it will start, but probably like with the trial or something, and kind of seeing how it led up to the acquittal. All right, so chapter 1 is called 10 Years in LA Now. And it's interesting to me too that the setting, it doesn't have a specific year, because I was thinking when it talked about race, class, sex, law enforcement, I was thinking that almost sounded like it was during the counterculture revolution, but it almost could be a little bit later as well. So I think it's kind of interesting when authors do that. They kind of leave that up to interpretation, but they do obviously give signs along the way as to some hints as to kind of when really it might be set. All right, 10 years in LA now. Maya Seal removed 2 photographs from her briefcase. She held them face in against her skirt. This thing was all going to come down to timing. "Miss Seal," came the judge's voice, impatient. "We're waiting." Belen Vasquez, Maya's client, had suffered terrible abuse at the hands of her husband, Elian. There were extensive ER records to prove it. One morning, a few months back, Belen had snapped. She'd stabbed her husband while he was sleeping and then cut off his head with a pair of garden shears. Then she'd driven around for an entire day in her green Hyundai Elantra with the severed head mounted on the dash. Oh, dear gracious. Either nobody noticed or nobody wanted to get involved. Eventually, a cop had pulled her over, well, I guess so, but for running a red light, and she'd managed to stuff the head in the glove compartment. Y'all, what kind of book is this? The good news, from Maya's perspective, was that the prosecution had only one piece of solid physical evidence to use against Balin. The bad news is that the evidence was a head. I'm ready, Your Honor. Maya placed a reassuring hand on her client's shoulder. Then she walked slowly to the witness box, where Officer Jason Shaw sat waiting, his Distinguished Service Medal displayed prominently on the lapel of his blue LAPD uniform. Officer Shaw, she said, what happened when you pulled over Ms. Vasquez's car? Well, ma'am, like I was saying, my partner remained behind Ms. Vasquez's vehicle while I approached her window. He was going to be one of those cops who did the ma'am thing with her, wasn't he? Maya hated the ma'am thing. Not because she was 36, which she had to admit was probably ma'am worthy, but because it was such a transparent attempt to make her seem stuck up. She tucked her short dark hair behind her ear. And when you approached the window, did you observe Miss Vasquez sitting in the driver's seat? Yes, ma'am. Did you ask her for her license and registration? Yes, ma'am. Did she give them to you? Yes, ma'am. Did you ask her for anything else? I asked her why there was blood on her hands. Officer Shaw paused. Ma'am. And what did Mrs. Vasquez tell you? She said that she had cut her hand in the kitchen. And did she present any evidence to support her claim? Yes, ma'am. She showed me the bandage across her right palm. Did you ask her anything else? I asked her to step out of the vehicle. Why? Because there was blood on her hands. But hadn't she given you a perfectly reasonable explanation for the blood? I wanted to investigate further. Why did you need to investigate further? Maya asked, if Mrs. Vasquez had given you a reasonable explanation. Shaw looked at her as if she were a hall monitor sending him to the principal's office for some minor infraction. Intuition, he said. Maya actually felt sorry for the poor guy right then. The prosecutor hadn't prepped him well. I'm sorry, officer. Can you describe your intuition in more detail? Well, I saw some of the head. He was only digging himself in deeper. Maybe, Maya repeated slowly. You saw some of the head? It was dark, Shaw admitted, but maybe I subconsciously noticed some of the hair, like the hair on the head sticking out of the glove compartment. She glanced at the prosecutor. He silently scratched at his white beard while Shaw single-handedly detonated his case. Time for the photographs. Maya held up one in each hand. The two photos showed different angles of a man's head stuffed inside a glove compartment. Elian Vasquez had a buzz cut and a thin, unkempt mustache crusted with blood. There was a streak of crimson across his cheek. The head had clearly bled out elsewhere and then later been stuffed into the compartment on top of the worn Hyundai manual and old registration cards. Officer, did you take these photographs on the night in question? She handed them to him. I did, ma'am. Do they not show the head entirely inside the glove compartment? The head is in the glove compartment, ma'am. Excuse me. Why was the glove compartment closed when you asked Mrs. Vasquez? I'm sorry, was the glove compartment closed when you asked Ms. Vasquez to exit her vehicle? Yes, ma'am. So how could you have maybe seen the head if it was entirely inside the glove compartment? I don't know, but I mean, we found it there when we searched. You can't tell me the head wasn't in there because it was. I'm asking you why you searched the car in the first place. She had blood on her hands. Didn't you say a moment ago that you maybe saw hair poking out of the glove compartment? I can have the court reporter read that back to you. No, I mean, there was blood. Maybe I saw some hair. Oh, I don't know. Intuition, like I said. Maya stood very close to the witness box. Which was it, officer? Did you perform a search of Ms. Vasquez's vehicle because you saw some of the severed head, which you could not have, or did you perform the search because there was blood on her hands, for which there was a perfectly legal explanation? Shaw stewed angrily as he struggled to find an acceptable answer. He just realized how badly he'd screwed up. Maya glanced over at the prosecutor, who was now rubbing his temples. He looked like he had a migraine. The prosecutor made a heroic attempt to pin Shaw down to either one of his two stories, but the damage had been done. The judge ordered both sides to have briefs filed by the following Monday, at which point he'd make a final ruling on the admissibility of the severed head. Maya sat down beside her client and whispered that the hearing had gone very well. Phelan mumbled, "Okay," but didn't make eye contact. She wasn't ready to celebrate yet. Maya appreciated the cautious pessimism. The bailiff escorted Bellin out of the courtroom back to lockup. Then the secretary called for the next hearing. The prosecutor sidled over. "If you get the head excluded, I'll give you man too." Maya scoffed. "If you lose the head, you lose the body in the kitchen and the shears in the drawer. You won't have a shred of physical to connect my client to the death of her husband." Her husband, who she killed. Have you seen the ER records, the broken ribs, the broken jaw? If you want to argue self-defense, be my guest. If you want to argue that her husband deserved to die, you might get a jury on board. But suppressing the head, really? She's not doing time. That's non-negotiable. Today, you can have reckless endangerment, time served. Or else you can try your luck next week after the ruling. Maya nodded toward the judge. How do you think that's going to go? The prosecutor grumbled something into his tie about needing his boss's sign-off, then slunk away. Maya slid the photographs back into her briefcase and shut the clasps with a satisfying snap. The hallway outside was crowded. Dozens of conversations echoed off the domed ceiling. Courthouses were among the last places where all strata of society still brushed shoulders. Rich, poor, old, young, people of every racial and ethnic background in Los Angeles walked across the marble floor. Hurrying to make it back to the office, she enjoyed being temporarily enveloped in the Democratic crush. "Maya!" The voice came from behind her. She recognized it instantly, but it couldn't be him, could it? Forcing herself to breathe, she turned. For the first time in 10 years, she found herself face to face with Rick Leonard. He was still thin, still tall. He still wore glasses, though the silver wire frames he'd worn as a grad student had become the thick black frames of a sophisticated professional. He still dressed formally, today in a light gray suit. He must be in his late 30s now, just a bit older than she was. The decade's wear had cruelly made him handsomer. "I'm sorry," Rick said. His voice sounded smooth, assured. "I didn't mean to sneak up on you." Maya remembered Rick's awkward hesitancy. Now he carried himself like a man who'd finally settled into his own skin. She, on the other hand, was flushed with anxiety. "What are you doing here? Can we talk?" There had been plenty of times over the past decade when she'd been sure she'd seen him. In grocery stores, restaurants, and once, even more improbably, on a flight to Seattle. Each time, she'd felt her skin go cold before she'd been able to reassure herself that she was imagining it. What would the chances have been that she'd just bump into him in a Walgreens? But now he was really here, in the courthouse. This was happening. She dumbly repeated her question. "What are you doing here?" "I tried email, phone, your office, but I never heard anything back. I came to talk to you." She hadn't received any messages, but of course she wouldn't have. Her assistant was under strict instructions to hang up on anyone who called asking about the case. Maya kept a spam filter on her email that redirected any incoming messages containing the names of the case's key figures. Her street address was unlisted. She'd purchased her house under an LLC to keep her name off the property records. Maya had achieved the precise level of infamy at which total strangers knew exactly one thing about her. Sometimes she imagined what it would be like to be an actress embroiled in scandal, or even a politician in the throes of disgrace. These people's misdeeds were cataloged, public, keyword searchable. They were open books of iniquity, but all of Maya's sins remained blessedly private, with one exception. Whenever anyone realized who she was, it was the only thing they'd want to talk about. Prospective paralegals had alluded to it during their job interviews. Prospective boyfriends had dropped hints about it on first dates. Maya avoided corner seats at birthday dinners so as to never again end up trapped at the table's end, fake laughing off some joke about it made by a friend of a friend. She had done everything she could to put it behind her, and it had not been enough. Evidentiary hearings were public. Her name would have been on Balin Vasquez's court filings. Showing up here had been Rick's best way to find her. "What do you want to talk about?" she asked, pretending not to know the answer. "The anniversary's coming up," Rick said. "I hadn't thought about it," Maya lied. "On October 19th, it will have been exactly 10 years since Bobby Knock was found not guilty of murdering Jessica Silver." Maya noticed his careful use of the passive voice. But she knew all too well that someone had found Bobby Knock not guilty of Jessica Silver's murder. Actually, 12 people had. Maya and Rick had been 2 of them. Hang on, not yet. "10 years ago, before she was a lawyer, before she had ever seen the inside of a courtroom, Maya had answered a summons for jury duty. She'd checked a box and put a prepaid envelope in the mail, and then she'd spent 5 months of trial and deliberation with Rick and the others, sequestered from the outside world. None of them had been prepared for the controversy that greeted their verdict. Only after they'd emerged from their sequester did Maya know that 84% of Americans believed Bobby Knock had murdered Jessica Silver, which meant that 84% of Americans believed Maya and Rick had let a child killer go free. Maya had searched to find another issue on which 84% of the population agreed. Only 79% of Americans, she discovered, believed in God. She was grateful to learn that at least 94% believed the moon landing was real. Under the hot glare of public condemnation, Rick had been the first of the jurors to recant. He'd gone on all the news shows and apologized. He'd begged the forgiveness of Jessica Silver's family. He'd published a book about their experience, claiming that their unjust verdict had been entirely Maya's fault. He accused her of bullying him into acquitting a man he'd always been sure deep down was a murderer. A few of the others had joined him in renouncing their decision. Most, like Maya, had stayed quiet, hoping to wait out the storm. Sometimes she still wished she'd chucked the jury summons in the trash like a normal person. "All the news channels are planning retrospectives," Rick continued. "CNN, Fox, MSNBC, plus 60 Minutes, some of the other magazine shows." Of course they would, given all the attention the trial received at the time, given what's happened since. Over the years, she talked about the trial with her parents. She talked about it with her friends, of which, since her notoriety, there were fewer. She talked about it with a parade of therapists. She'd provided the broad strokes to her senior partners and recited anodyne details to some of her clients. But in 10 years, she had never, not once, discussed the case publicly. "I'm not talking about what happened," Maya said. "Not to CNN, not to 60 Minutes, not even to you. I'm done." "Have you heard of Murder Town?" Rick asked. "No. It's a podcast. It's very popular." "Okay." "They're making a docuseries for Netflix, 8 hours adopted from the podcast." Maya thought about all the hours of her life that had been swallowed up by the Jessica Silver case. 4 months of trial, followed by 3 weeks of heated deliberations. During the sequester, every waking hour of Maya's life had been, in a sense, given over to the case. When she thought about the suite at the Omni Hotel in which she'd slept every night, how well she could recall every strip of fleur-de-lis wallpaper in that room, every inch of beige carpet, it seemed the case had consumed her sleeping hours as well. Sometimes, back then, to pass the time, she'd done the math in her head. 20 weeks times 7 days a week times 24 hours in a day was, she still knew the multiplication by heart. Who, she asked, wants to spend 8 more hours going over what happened to Jessica Silver? A lot of people, and I'm one of them. You're involved in this podcast? It's a docuseries. I'm helping the producers, getting all of us together. All of us, the jury. Maya felt sick. We can share what we think about what happened, Rick said. After all this time, and knowing what we know now. Rick paused as if they were already on television. Would you still vote not guilty? Maya was suddenly aware of the crowds pushing past them in the courthouse hallway. All these strangers who'd come to this building for justice, absolution, or revenge. No thanks, Maya said. I'll talk to the others, Rick offered. They're coming. All of them? Well, Carolina died. I don't know if you knew that. Maya didn't. Carolina Cancio had been in her 80s during the trial. Still, Maya felt a sting of embarrassment at being so out of touch after everything they'd been through. 20 weeks times 7 days times 24 hours. But Maya hadn't spoken to Carolina or any of the others in years. How? She asked. When? Cancer. 4 years ago, her family said. Rick shrugged. And Wayne told the producers no. Actually, he told them, heck no. Wayne Russell. Maya wondered whether he'd ever been able to get himself together. She hoped so. But if he was the same man she'd seen at the end of their deliberations, it was best for him to stay away. But all the rest, Rick continued, the other 8, they're coming. I hope you all have a good time. I came here to ask you to join us. No. We were wrong, Rick said. Maya couldn't hold back a sudden flare of anger. I read your book. You have every right to torture yourself with as many regrets as you like, but leave me out of it. A few strangers glanced over, then quickly went about their business. A girl died, Rick said, with an earnestness that Maya recognized all too well, and her killer went free because we made a mistake. Doesn't that bother you? Don't you want to do something, anything, to make up for it? Even if I thought Bobby was guilty, which I do not, there's nothing we can do about it. We have to move on. Rick looked around the courthouse hallway. You're a criminal defense lawyer. You work in the same building that Bobby's trial was in. You've moved on all of 2 floors away. Goodbye, Maya said. I found something. What? I've been investigating. She wasn't surprised. She knew better than most how obsessive he could be. Once he became fixated on something, especially if it concerned unfairness or injustice, he never let it go. Especially if, but when it came to the Jessica Silver case, he wasn't the only one. Jessica Silver's parents, Lou and Elaine, had been worth $3 billion. Billion with a B as in boy. Heck, Maya thought, by now they're probably worth twice that. Lou Silver owned some meaningful percentage of the real estate in Los Angeles County. His daughter's disappearance had been investigated by the very best. Dozens of LAPD detectives worked this case, Maya said. The FBI, journalists from all over the world descended on the city. PIs worked nights and weekends for the family, teams of lawyers on both sides of the trial, armies of amateur bloggers and conspiracy theorists with YouTube channels, and Maya stopped herself. She couldn't allow herself to get sucked back in. There is no more evidence left to be found. Well, I found something. What? Come to the taping. What did you find? He stepped closer. She could feel his warm breath on her cheek. I can't tell you now. It's complicated. It's delicate. Look, just come to the taping, and I'll show everyone, all of us, in incontrovertible evidence that Bobby Knock killed Jessica Silver. Maya looked into his pleading eyes. She could see how much he needed this. He believed to the core of his being that they had made an unforgivable mistake. Maya didn't know if Bobby Knock had killed Jessica Silver. That was just the thing. She'd never known. That's why she'd acquitted him, not because he was innocent, but because there simply wasn't enough evidence to ever know for sure. Better, she'd argued, that 10 guilty men go free than one innocent be wrongly punished. Maybe Rick genuinely believed that he'd found elusive, definitive proof, but Maya had long since given up any hope that it existed. She had spent 10 years learning to live with her doubts, and Rick, if he was ever going to get free of this, would have to do the same. Rick had once been someone she'd cared about. His was not a face that should cause the sick clenching feeling that was now happening in her stomach. He was a good person. He deserved a happiness that she knew would never be found amid the detritus of Jessica Silver's death. Good luck, Maya said quietly. I hope you get what you want from this, but I can't be part of it. She turned and walked away. She did not look back. Maya's office at Cantwell and Myers was on the 43rd floor of the firm's downtown skyscraper. She sat at her desk, a mid-century modern piece that her assistant had picked out from a corporate furnishings catalog. She was finding it hard to focus. She turned to the windows and took in the skyline of the new downtown, a fleet of sleek skyscrapers cresting into the air. Half of these buildings weren't even here a decade ago. How many of them were owned by Lou Silver? The blue skies over Los Angeles looked eternal, even primordial. The same color today, the same color tomorrow, the exact same shade of blue as they had been 10 years ago. On the afternoon, a teenage girl vanished. Sorry, pages are sticking. It had happened only a mile from this very spot. People had always said that LA had no sense of history, but Maya had learned that precisely the opposite was true. LA was a time capsule of itself, wrapped up and preserved forever in an immutable sky blue shell. Got a quick sec? Craig Rogers stood in the open doorway. He wore a blue suit, perfectly tailored. His close-cropped hair was sprinkled with white at the temples. When she'd first started working for Craig, she'd had to consult his CV to figure out how old he was. Was he closer to 30 or to 50? It seemed impossible to tell. She'd finally found his year of college graduation and did the math. He was 56 years old. In his youth, Craig had been a civil rights attorney. He'd been one of the crusading black lawyers bringing civil suits against the crooked LAPD officers of the Rampart Division back in the 80s. In the 90s, he'd worked with the NAACP Legal Defense Fund on the Thomas versus County of Los Angeles. Now, he was a senior partner at Cantwell and Myers. Had Craig sold out? Maybe. But he hadn't come cheap. At Cantwell and Myers, he had unparalleled resources to devote to the cases he deemed most important. Of course, she said. He shut the door and took a seat. If the prosecutor on the Balin Vasquez case had gone over Maya's head and delivered a plea offer straight to Craig, she'd bury that jerk. Our PR department, Craig said, has been contacted by the producers of something called Murder Town. She should have known that Rick Leonard wouldn't be put off so easily. Of course he'd reach out to her boss. They're doing an 8-hour docuseries on the Jessica Silver case, she said, and they want all the former jurors, me included, to participate. So they've spoken to you. Maya briefly described her run-in with Rick this morning. Craig seemed pleased. This is excellent. You'll do the show? I said no. Craig frowned. May I ask why? I don't believe there's meaningful new evidence left to be found, even if Rick has fashioned himself into some kind of amateur sleuth. The facts are long established. Blood, DNA, security cameras, cell tower logs, the ambiguous text messages. She still remembered it all. The bones have been picked clean. I thought they never found the body. Metaphorically. Ooh, now I want to know what she did with the body. If she severed the head, I want to know what happened. Craig leaned back in his chair as if to suggest that those bones might be more than metaphor. There's no way, Maya said, that Rick Leonard has found Jessica Silver's body. Oh, I'm sorry, Jessica Silver. I was thinking about the head and the husband. My bad. Got the two bodies mixed up. Amateur or professional, if you spend 10 years digging, but this is precisely why I would suggest that you attend. Define suggest. It's your choice, Craig said, which was something people only say when it wasn't. You're free to do whatever you like, which was something people only said when you weren't. The firm is with you. Maya was well aware that her role on the Bobby Knock jury had been among the reasons that Cantwell and Myers had hired her. Had it helped her to sign clients? Of course it had. It was part of her sales pitch. Many criminal defense attorneys had been former prosecutors, but Maya had been a former juror, and in one of the most infamous trials of all time. She hadn't just been on the other side of the aisle, she'd been on the other side of the courtroom. Who knew better than she did how a jury decides? What defendant, guilty or otherwise, would not want the counsel of the woman responsible for the acquittal of Bobby Knock? Yes, the verdict had helped Maya get her foot in the door, but the verdict hadn't finished 11th in its class at UC Berkeley Law. The verdict hadn't guided 36 clients through intricate plea bargains and won acquittals in all 4 of her cases that had gone to trial. The verdict hadn't made partner in 3 years, and given everything else that the verdict had done to her over the years, she refused to apologize for the few things that the verdict had done for her. Everyone already thinks Bobby Knock did it, Maya said. Who cares what Rick Leonard says for the 1000th time on a TV show? You're a partner now, Craig said, which means that anything you say, you're a partner now, Craig said, which means that anything said about you personally reflects on all of the other partners. We support you 100% on issues of character, which is why I would encourage you to support yourself. Craig's ability to frame everything he wanted as if it were in her own interest was impressive. What he really meant was that the firm would defend itself from being tarnished by Maya's role in a case from which they had not earned a dime. It's one thing to have stuck to my guns for a decade, out of principle, she said, but it's another thing altogether to be an idiot clinging to a stupid decision even after new evidence proves me wrong. We all endeavor to learn from our mistakes, don't we? The twisted part was that if Rick Leonard really did have new evidence that definitively incriminated Bobby Knock, and Maya publicly apologized, she'd be in a better position PR-wise than she was in now. Some defense attorneys might be recalcitrant apologists for killers, but not Maya. She'd been someone who could claim to have followed the evidence wherever it led her, even if that meant changing her mind. She'd walk into courtrooms ever after with the presumption that she was a straight shooter. All she would have to do after hearing this mysterious new evidence would be to admit that she was wrong. Maya didn't say much as Craig handed her a memo with the details. The reunion would take place in a month. Once again, the jury would be invited to spend the night at the Omni Hotel on Olive Street, the same hotel at which they had originally been sequestered. Maya never actually uttered the word yes at any point in the conversation. She just nodded and listened, trying to ignore the twitchy feeling of being trapped. Finally, Craig stood. He glanced at her desk and grimaced. Is that Balin Vasquez's husband's head? She'd set the photographs out earlier. Yeah. I heard they're giving you reckless endangerment. Well done. After he left, Maya remained seated, tapping her fingers against the smooth surface of the grim photographs. What What would she have made of these 10 years earlier? The earnest, naive 26-year-old girl who'd first entered the courthouse that was a different person, one whom Maya dimly recalled like someone she'd met at a party. Sometimes Maya still got angry. There were so many people to be angry with. The judge who'd kept them sequestered for too long, the attorneys who'd manipulated them, the talk show host who'd turned them into punchlines. She wanted to shout at all of them. She hadn't killed Jessica Silver. Jessica's face was forever submerged just beneath the waterline of her memory. At any moment, it could resurface. She'd be standing in line at a coffee shop, and suddenly there it was. Jessica's blue eyes, her smooth cheeks, her incandescent smile. The famous image of a beautiful young girl who'd simply been wiped off the face of the earth. Whoever had murdered her was the monster who deserved all of Maya's rage, and everyone else's too. And yet, sitting at her desk, the killer was not the person at whom Maya directed her anger. No, the present inheritor of Maya's bitterness, the person most responsible for putting her in this position, was juror 272. Okay, end of chapter 1. So it's interesting. The second chapter starts from Rick's perspective, and it's May of 2009. So we can assume then, make some assumptions here, some inferencing, that when it said today, that's actually 2019. So it's very current set. It sounds so good. Yeah, it's published in 2020. So it came out just this year. Yeah, that sounds really good. This is going to be my next read. So I hope you pick up a copy of this and check it out and let me know what you think. It's pretty short. So it seems like it's going to be like a super easy, super quick read. It doesn't seem like super complex, super. It seems like, you know, you could knock this out pretty easily. So happy reading and enjoy it. And I look forward to hearing what you think.